So when you factor in the cataclysm, then you have a different reckoning of the past. Now, if you factor in the cataclysm, you can now be in accord with what the ancients believed and still understand that much of what archaeologists are saying is true because they're recording a rebeginning, not the beginning.
Right, right.
And from that perspective, it makes sense. You can make a lot more sense of what you're discovering. You can make a lot more sense of Göbekli Tepe, for example. It makes sense why we see what appears to be these cultures that spring up out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the Egyptian culture, for example, the ancient Egyptians, there's really no record of them advancing from nothing, from hunter-gatherer people to this magnificent civilization. Well, that would make sense. You would not find that sort of evolutionary progression if the descendants of Noah had the knowledge from the pre-flood world. They had some of this knowledge and tradition, but they didn't have the populations yet to build,
right,
to do large-scale agriculture and to build large complexes and other sophisticated projects, aqueducts and temples and so forth. The knowledge would be there, but not the workforce.
Right.
And so once the workforce is accumulated and the population is large enough and all of these different cultures get sequestered in their own territories, then suddenly they can start to rebuild and recreate some of what was, and recover some of what was lost in the pre-flood world, because they already have the knowledge. The legacy is there.
Yeah, they didn't have to learn it incrementally. They just needed to reproduce enough to execute on what they already knew.
It takes a population.
Yeah.
You cannot have a civilization cannot advance without a robust population.
Right.
You need cities. You need governmental structures. You need armies. These things are necessary for the flourishment of civilization. And so even if you have the knowledge to build a great city, if you don't have the workforce, then that knowledge is just going to it's going to be collecting dust in the library of your brain.
Yeah.
Because you don't have the workforce, you simply do not have the resources, human resources that are required to go and harvest the natural resources in order to build the complexes.
Yeah.
And even to do other things, like even today we take for granted that, we have papers everywhere. We can get it easily. Paper took a lot of work to make. So writing and different forms of art were not nearly as easy as they are today, and they would not have been well preserved.
Yeah. One of my favorite arguments that I hear people make is, "Oh, why isn't there more art depicting the kinds of things you guys are describing?" Right? About this is in reference to like giants and the pre-flood world and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, post-flood, people weren't really like sitting around bored thinking about, I wonder how I could draw this landscape with that giant human over there. These guys were working the ground night to day. They were farming. They were surviving. They didn't have leisure time to develop their art abilities. You know what I mean?
They were surviving post-cataclysm. They were surviving in a world that was brutal.
Yeah.
Brutal. After the flood, that world would have been absolutely brutal.
Yeah.
Even though, as I said before, the knowledge was there. It was enough of it, not all of it, but enough of the knowledge from the pre-flood world, from the antediluvian world, was preserved by Noah and his sons. If you subscribe to the biblical narrative, as I do, and even if you don't, if you subscribe to some other narrative, it's still the same. The fact remains that knowledge would have been preserved to some extent.
Right.
And waiting for civilization to grow, for the population to grow large enough to implement the knowledge. And this is, I think, what we actually see in the archaeological record. Why is it? Where did the legacy come from? Where did the civilization come from? The Sumerians and the Akkadians kind of pop out of nowhere.
Right.
The ancient Egyptians pop out of nowhere. Where did this knowledge come from? It's clearly a legacy, and I think we can believe their accounts, which is the legacy comes from the old world that was destroyed in cataclysm. So that's a very different view. I think it is the correct archaeological, historical view. And if you're working from that view, you can make a lot more sense of what we observe in regard to the remains of the megaliths, for example. We can make a lot more sense of it if we reject uniformitarianism and revert back to the what I would view as the correct doctrine, which is catastrophism.
Yeah. It kind of is the only theory, right, that makes sense and that removes a ton of holes in the modern narrative. One of which you keep bringing up, and I've only learned this in the past 3 years or so, that the current narrative is monkeys evolved to cavemen or whatever, in the cave rubbing sticks for fire, then to hunter-gatherers, then to Sumerians, Egyptians, advanced civilization. There's no record of advancement from the hunter-gatherer to the Egyptian civilization.
Right, that's right. There's a missing link, just like in the evolutionary theory. There's a missing link.
Yeah, there's no building. We started with stick houses to mud huts to stone houses to pyramids. There isn't that trajectory. There is hunter-gatherers and teepees, okay, to Egyptian pyramids.
That's right.
Where's the in-between?
Exactly. And this is a question that historians and archaeologists really struggle to answer. But the answer is apparent. They tell you. These cultures tell you
right
where the legacy came from.
Yeah, but Tim, they're dumb. They're just making stuff
up. They're stupid. These are ignorant.
It?
Yeah, right. Exactly. So this is the problem with the Darwinian perspective of the historical narrative.
Bigger,
the
better,
timeline
stronger.
of history. We have this ridiculous inverse idea, inverse in regard to the reality that the further we go back in time, the more ignorant our ancestors become.
Right.
Whereas in reality, and this is what the biblical narrative conveys, and I think also what people who've spent time studying and going out in the field and looking at, for example, I'll reference again the megaliths, which are just absolutely superior to any masonry we have today. We'll realize very quickly that our antecedents were brilliant, and that they knew things that we have forgotten,
right?
And that they must have been much more intelligent than we give them credit for. And that's the correct view, the historical narrative. The further you go back in time, that timeline, the further you go back in time, the more intelligent the human species becomes.
So it's the opposite of the Darwinian
view. That is the correct narrative. So if you plug that in, that our antecedents were far more extraordinary than we give them credit for, and that there was a cataclysm. So you plug in the catastrophism and you understand that our antecedents were magnificently intelligent and physically robust. Then everything fits together. Everything we find, you don't have to obfuscate archaeological artifacts that don't fit the Darwinian uniformitarian paradigm of history, because that's what archaeologists do. I've seen them do it myself. I've witnessed this in Peru. If there's an artifact that's discovered that belays the accepted historical narrative about the Incan Empire, then that artifact is just kind of intentionally lost and forgotten about. It's boxed up and put on the shelf in some back room somewhere in a museum. This is the problem when you have an when you have an intellectual community entrenched in a particular doctrine, in a doctrine, their entire world, their financial sustenance, their credibility,
all of it,
their job opportunities, everything in their ecosystem, whether they're, an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a historian, it only works if they adhere to the narrative.
Right.
They can only survive in that ecosystem if they're supporting the narrative. As soon as you have somebody that begins to pull the thread on another narrative and begins to find evidence that, hey, we've got this wrong, that person is ostracized. So you have this, as I said, you have this entrenched intelligentsia as it pertains to the narrative of history, and they have adopted, they're hamstrung with the Darwinian uniformitarian historical timeline.
Right.
They've hamstrung themselves with this. And so this is the situation that we have now, and they simply cannot accept that our antecedents were as magnificent as they were. They will say the ancient Egyptians were a magnificent culture, but as you progress further back down the timeline, you end up to you end up with the Flintstones in their perspective, which is absurd.
So Flintstones to Egyptians.
That's not what the evidence indicates.
Yeah.
The evidence indicates that we have profound knowledge.
Right.
The further you go back in time,
Right.
profound knowledge related to astronomy, related to mathematics, related to a host of scientific inquiries. You have profound knowledge that is evident in the deep past. In fact, the ancient Egyptians, who we think were so magnificent, and they were, they look back to their antecedents with awe. They look back with longing to the achievements of the antediluvian world. Everything that these post-flood cultures were doing was trying to regain some vestige of the glory, of the magnificence of their antecedents, of their antediluvian antecedents. Every single major culture, even in the Inca in Peru, every major culture, every primary culture on earth is looking back into the world before the cataclysm with longing.
Wow.
And reverence, because they knew that the achievements of the past were greater than their own achievements. And part of that has to do with the fact that they also knew that much of those achievements were the result of man intermingling with the gods in the world before the great cataclysm. And so that knowledge was bequeathed to mankind. It was the Promethean fire. And so you see this, what you see is a record of the human species trying to regain the glory of the antediluvian world, some vestige of the glory of the antediluvian world. That is the correct narrative. That's it.
Right.
And again, when you plug that in, when you plug in the cataclysm and you plug in the superiority, the mental and physical superiority of our antecedents, then everything makes sense.
It's the only thing that makes sense and removes all of the holes in the narrative. And I think that's why you're starting to see a shift in kind of the mainstream, or people that are breaking into the mainstream, right?